Okay, so today we're going to dive into a pretty intense experience, and someone has bravely shared their uh, story with us.
Yeah, it's really amazing that we have such detailed notes to work with here. This is
Mhm.
going to allow us to really trace what happened and sort of map out, the whole experience.
Exactly, and it's a powerful story because it starts out, pretty normal, like almost like any first-time experience with edibles could go, and then it takes this really unexpected turn.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so valuable, for all of us to understand because I think there's this idea out there that, edibles are somehow like safer or more predictable than other ways of consuming cannabis, but as we're going to see, that's not always the case.
Definitely not. So let's start at the very beginning. Around 1 p.m.,
Yeah.
you took what seemed like a very small dose, right? Just a quarter of a gummy.
Right. And that's pretty typical for someone with no tolerance to start slow and see how things go.
So what do those first few hours feel like?
Well, you described feeling pretty sleepy, kind of zoned out, and that's not unusual at all, especially when you're first getting used to the effects of THC. And, as you were falling asleep, you mentioned those strange, vivid, but distorted images.
Right, right. Those could be, an early sign of things starting to shift a little bit perceptually.
Exactly. And then, we get to that point around 7:22 p.m. where you woke up and it's fascinating because you said you felt no different. Like your brain was empty, no room for anxiety, even experiencing depersonalization, but without any worry.
It's almost like a peaceful detachment, which is
Mm.
not something you usually hear associated with depersonalization.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It kind of suggests that maybe dissociation itself isn't always a bad thing. It's more about the context and what comes along with it that makes it, distressing or not. But either way, this particular feeling was short-lived because by 7:59 you were noticing it starting to fade.
Right. So it was kind of this wave that came and went. And then around 10 p.m., you decided to take another quarter of the gummy.
Yeah, so bumping up the dose a little bit, and that's when things started to feel a bit more noticeable.
You mentioned feeling giggly, and then this really striking sensation of becoming a hologram, with your memories feeling like they were just behind you.
That's a very common way people describe depersonalization, that sense of being detached from your own experiences and your sense of self, almost like you're watching yourself from a slight distance.
And then sending that video of a cat to a friend, it's almost like you were trying to connect with something or find some humor in the midst of that altered state.
Right, it's like reaching out for something familiar in the midst of all these changes.
Okay, so we've gone from tiny dose to slightly larger dose with mild effects, then more noticeable but still seemingly manageable effects. Then comes around 1 am,
Hmm.
and that's when you took the final half of the gummy. And that seems to be the turning point where everything really escalated.
And this is where we really see the tricky nature of edibles because the effects can take a while to fully kick in compared to smoking or vaping.
Hmm.
So taking that remaining half likely pushed you past a threshold and led to a much more intense and overwhelming experience.
By 1:32, you're messaging a friend describing intense depersonalization, but still not really bothered. You're feeling warm, you're smiling and laughing uncontrollably, but then this seemingly harmless comment about breathing becoming manual. That's what really seems to have triggered the intense anxiety.
Yeah, it's amazing how just a suggestion, even a seemingly random one, can completely shift a psychoactive experience. Once that thought about manually controlling your breathing entered your mind, it became this focal point for anxiety, especially combined with that hallucination of the door moving.
And that fear of forgetting how to breathe, I mean, that's a
Mm.
primal fear, right? It's no wonder that triggered such a strong panic response.
Yeah, absolutely. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. You described this freeze and flight mode time feeling stretched, that intense adrenaline coupled with numbness, even your attempts to ground yourself with cold water didn't work.
And your vision was impaired too.
Right, those rapid eye movements are another sign of that heightened physiological arousal. Your system was totally overwhelmed by the anxiety.
Then there's that out-of-body experience in the kitchen, trying to dry your hands, seeing yourself from an external perspective and trying to reassure yourself. That's a really unsettling image.
That's a classic sign of depersonalization taken to an extreme. That sensation of observing yourself from outside your body, it can be really disorienting and frightening.
And it just kept escalating.
Yeah.
You ended up collapsed on the sofa, still struggling to breathe, even though intellectually you knew you were okay.
That's the thing about panic attacks, right? Your rational mind knows you're safe, but your body is just flooded with these overwhelming sensations.
And the slow music, the updates to your friend, nothing really
Yeah.
provided much comfort.
Your body's stress response was in full swing at that point, making logical reassurance ineffective.
And then comes this really distressing moment back in your room. You take a knife and attempt to cut your arm to try to shock yourself out of it all while repeating affirmations.
That's a really concerning sign of just how desperate you were feeling that urge to self-harm, even in a way that wasn't intended to be lethal, suggests complete loss of control.
And even the somatic exercises failed.
Right, which is really interesting because those techniques usually rely on bringing awareness to your body to help ground you. But in this case, your system was so dysregulated that even that wasn't working.
So you went to seek help from your father, and you described feeling detached from your body as you went to wake him up, and then his suggestion of a VK that felt so out of character and surreal.
And, while he probably meant well, suggesting alcohol in that situation isn't really the best idea when someone is in an altered state. Introducing another substance, especially one with depressant effects, can have unpredictable and potentially dangerous consequences.
And your instincts were right. You Googled the interaction and found that it could worsen the effects. And then those fragmented memories being in his room, then the kitchen, then back in bed.
That's typical of extreme anxiety and dissociation. Your brain's ability to process and store memories can get really disrupted.
You finally managed to fall asleep around 3 a.m., but even waking up at 5:30 wasn't a complete return to normal. You reported ongoing background panic later that morning.
And we know from your friend's message that the next day you were still feeling the effects you tweeted about it being a mistake and experiencing panic and shaking.
And you also mentioned starting to have flashbacks to childhood trauma that same day.
So this experience really went beyond just the immediate effects of the gummy. It seems to have acted as a trigger, bringing up past trauma and leading to ongoing anxiety and emotional distress.
Okay, so the first part of this deep dive ends with a pretty clear conclusion. It was a traumatizing and intense experience. But then we have this whole other document detailing your efforts to cope with this trauma in the month that followed, starting on February 28th. And it's really remarkable how proactive you were in trying to manage everything that was going on.
Absolutely. Your notes provide this incredibly valuable window into the recovery process and the different strategies you were using. And, it wasn't a linear path. There were ups and downs, but you were actively engaging with your healing.
In those early days, you focused on grounding exercises, which makes sense given the depersonalization and derealization you experienced.
Right. Grounding techniques are all about bringing yourself back to the present moment through your senses, and they can be really helpful for managing dissociation.
You also engaged in a lot of distractions, video games, music, online content, drawing, baking. It was like you were trying to create a sense of normalcy and regulate your emotions through these activities.
Those are all really common coping mechanisms, and they can be effective for providing temporary relief from difficult feelings. And then, you mentioned that positive interaction with your father and making a deliberate effort to go to bed early to avoid flashbacks. Those are all signs that you were actively trying to create a sense of safety and avoid potential triggers.
But then around March 4th and 5th, things took a bit of an unexpected turn with what you described as a hypomanic episode.
Right, and this highlights how complex and unpredictable our responses to trauma can be.
You mentioned excessive creative activity, unusual online behavior, sleep disturbances, and even getting banned from a Discord server.
And that struggle to differentiate fantasy from reality, that's a pretty significant sign of the impact this experience was having on your mental state.
It's like this whole other layer of challenges emerged on top of everything else.
Right, and it could be that this was your system's way of responding to the intense stress, or it could point to a pre-existing vulnerability that was brought to the surface by the experience with the gummy.
And then you got that CBD vape looking for those calming effects without the THC and the potential for more anxiety.
It's like you were trying to find a way to manage your anxiety without triggering those same overwhelming feelings.
And then on March 7th, that really dismissive letter about your mental health that triggered a really strong reaction. You described hysterical laughter, followed by using the vape to calm down.
That really speaks to the need for validation and understanding when you're struggling with mental health challenges.
It's like you were looking for someone to acknowledge your experience, and that letter just felt like the opposite of that.
Exactly. And that laughter could have been a defense mechanism, a way of coping with the emotional overwhelm and the lack of empathy.
But then the next day, on March 8th, you found some positive validation through compliments on your art that you shared online.
Those small moments of recognition and appreciation can be so powerful when you're feeling vulnerable.
It's like a little glimmer of hope and connection.
Right. And it shows how important it is to find those supportive spaces and connections, especially when you're going through a tough time.
But then, just a day later, on March 9th, that attempt to engage in political discussion online led to harassment, triggering dissociation, and a foggy mental state.
And the server's stance on free speech, allowing that abusive content to remain, that's really problematic. It creates an environment where it's hard to feel safe and express yourself freely.
It's like you were trying to connect and engage in a meaningful way, and it backfired.
And unfortunately, that led to a depressive episode around March 10th with those feelings of wanting dependence.
It's like this whole experience really sensitized you to negative social interactions.
Right, and that makes sense when you've been through something traumatic. Those kinds of experiences can feel even more intense and triggering.
The rest of mid-March was this mix of activities: watching a strange music video, reflecting on CBD use, connecting with what you described as dissociated parts of yourself, and continuing to express yourself creatively.
It sounds like you were really exploring different ways of processing and understanding your internal world.
Yeah, like trying to make sense of everything that had happened and find ways to cope.
And that awareness of those dissociated parts, that's really interesting. It suggests you were starting to pay attention to those different aspects of your experience and how they might be connected.
By March 15th to 17th, you reported increased depression and even anorexic thoughts.
This really highlights that recovery isn't always linear. There can be setbacks, and those depressive and anorexic thoughts show just how deep the impact of this experience was.
Yeah, it wasn't just about managing anxiety. It was about navigating this whole range of emotional and psychological challenges.
And it's a reminder that healing takes time, and it's not always straightforward.
Around March 19th, you had this realization that those dissociated parts might actually represent a system, and your father's recollection of your personality seeming fluid, with different parts emerging in response to triggers over time. That's a pretty significant insight.
It's like you were starting to piece together a deeper understanding of yourself and how you've adapted to stress and possibly past trauma over time.
And having that external confirmation from your father, that can be really validating.
Right. It reinforces those observations and helps to make sense of those internal experiences.
The end of March saw you reconnect with a friend and share a past trauma,
Yeah.
but also that lingering anxiety related to the bad trip.
It's like you were reaching out for connection and support while still grappling with the aftermath of what happened.
And then those unusual experiments with AI analyzing your poetry and then nonsensical text.
It's almost like you were using the AI as a way to externalize and process those overwhelming feelings.
And maybe even find some humor in the midst of it all.
Right, like using technology to make sense of the nonsensical.
But there were also those difficult moments, disappointment with a social media figure, the
Yeah.
news about your grandmother's dementia, and then that really visceral reaction on March 28th, a month after the initial incident, where you vomited after trying to eat a similar-looking gummy.
That physical reaction a month later really shows just how deeply that experience impacted you both mentally and physically.
It's like your body remembered that trauma and reacted instinctively.
It's a powerful example of how our experiences can shape our responses, even on a subconscious level.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we followed your journey through this really intense first experience with a weed gummy, from those unexpected initial effects to the escalating anxiety and altered perceptions, and then the desperate attempts to regain control. And then we moved into that month of recovery, witnessing your efforts to cope the emotional ups and downs and those emerging insights into your own internal landscape. It's been quite a journey.
And your detailed account really highlights several key takeaways: the unpredictable nature of psychoactive substances, especially edibles, and how individual responses can vary so much, the profound impact these experiences can have on our mental well-being, the importance of actively engaging in recovery, and the potential for gaining deeper self-understanding through these challenges.
It's a lot to take in, and your willingness to share this deeply personal experience offers us all so much to reflect on. So thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Yes, thank you.
And to everyone listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What does this story bring up for you? What insights or questions do you have about the complex interplay between substances, our brains, and our past experiences? Leave us a comment or send us a message, because these conversations are so important for understanding ourselves and each other.
It's all about learning and growing together.
Thanks for listening.